Welcome. Today I will be discussing aspects of Northern Canada that you should know before you move to work. I will only be scratching the surface of discussing the North, but we'll be highlighting some of the important discussions. Before I get into the history and major conversations, it is important to remove any biases and misconceptions regarding life in Northern Canada. There is a common misconception surrounding the Canadian North that it's considered in the wilderness, empty, inhabitable, a place for exploration, or has an abundance of resources that can be used and exploited. This perspective of the North is false and can be problematic when describing. Deriving from a settler colonial context, the idea that Northern Canada has been left untouched and can be used for human use only ignores the rich history of Indigenous peoples living in Canada and their values/practices. With the majority of the Canadian population residing in the South near the US border, most of the jobs and services are within this region. Money is then redistributed to the North based on the different populations within communities. In contrast to life in Southern Canada, the territories have smaller populations, but the larger cities have many of the services found in the South. The territories also have a large Indigenous population, especially seen in Nunavut. The reality of life in the Canadian territories is that it has been a home for First Nations and Inuit communities for centuries. Many of their cultural traditions and knowledge have been built around the land through practices such as hunting, fishing, and ceremonies. It is important to understand and respect that Indigenous nations existed well before colonialism in Canada. It is important to recognize the harmful impact that colonization has also had on Indigenous people as it resulted in cultural genocide, the dispossession of lands, and overall marginalization of Indigenous communities. The impact can still be felt as Inuit, First Nations, and Métis groups continue to fight for justice and work towards reconciliation. In the context of Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and land claims are important topics. Since colonization, the restriction of power to manage their own communities has been present, so there is an ongoing struggle for sovereignty, especially as the government has continuously let them down with the lack of support and funding. Self-governance would allow for Indigenous communities to be in control of land management, social policies, and their rights. As a result, comprehensive land claims were introduced in various regions of Canada to ensure that Indigenous groups could have official land rights over their traditional territories. The James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement in 1975 would set the precedent as the first comprehensive land claim signed by the Inuit, Cree, Quebec, and federal government. This claim was a direct result from the negotiation of the James Bay Hydro Project, in which Cree and Inuit peoples expressed how the project would interfere with their practices and destroy their traditional lands. Seen on the left of the screen is the map of the current comprehensive land claim agreements within Canada. In addition to land claims, devolution can be seen as a positive step towards the decentralization of power by the Canadian government. By providing the territories the opportunity to have political and economic control, this eliminates the pressure from the state to influence their decisions. On a broader level of looking at the Arctic, Northern Canada is considered part of it. With upcoming pressures such as the climate crisis and land management, discussions over who should control decisions regarding the Arctic has been a large topic. With the creation of the Arctic Council, it is primarily made of 8 states: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States. The complexity occurs as the states have different interests to use the Arctic as a source of power and exploitation. This can make things challenging as Indigenous groups living in the North have rights and have been there for centuries. So they need to be acknowledged, and this can also contrast with some of the decisions made by the Arctic Council. In addition, other members, including observer states and experts, can't directly influence decisions, but can act as advocates. Through an environmental lens, Northern Canada is an important ecosystem critical for humans and wildlife. As the issue of climate change emerges as a threat, this could be detrimental to the North. Due to Arctic amplification, the Arctic will experience higher rates of warming, which will exacerbate melting, alter climate patterns, and increase severe weather events. Wildlife endangerment is also an emerging issue within the North, threatened by climate change in addition to increased human induced activities that are altering their patterns. Seen with the potential introduction of pipelines and the Northwest Passage, there are lots of concerns brought up by Indigenous communities who will be directly affected by these projects if implemented. These environmental issues are concerning to the vitality of the Arctic and will have detrimental socioeconomic impacts on northern communities. When working in the North, it is important to have an understanding of accessibility to things such as public sectors, transportation, and infrastructure. In comparison to southern regions like Canada, accessibility is an issue in the Canadian territories due to the number of remote communities and cost to live within the North. From a transportation standpoint, air and seasonal sea lift are limited for the import of goods and travel. Due to the remotivity of many communities, most of the main sources of transportation are located in the denser urban regions. An example can be seen in Nunavut. There are roads within communities that do not connect to other remote communities. So, other sources such as planes and snowmobiles are used for long distance travel. Parts of the North lack adequate infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, telecommunications, housing, and energy, which is preventing socioeconomic growth. Especially due to the cold climate, adequate infrastructure is needed to withstand the frigid temperatures and ensure that communities are receiving the necessary infrastructure for their health, safety, and accessibility to services. The cost to transport, build, and maintain the infrastructure is costly, so isolated communities are disproportionately left without inadequate infrastructure. Seen through the public sector, accessibility to schools and hospitals can also be limited depending on where you are. This can be challenging if transportation is also limited/costly, especially in emergencies where a hospital may need to be accessed immediately. When we compare life in the North to the urban cities in southern Canada, we can see how uneven development is prevalent, causing inequalities for the communities up north. We are seeing that the main cause of many of the inequalities is the result of high cost of living and the lack of support provided by the Canadian government. With the current housing crisis in the North, there is a high number of homeless indigenous individuals who are homeless and are forced to live in inadequate housing conditions. Without enough resources distributed by the government, low income communities are not provided with the necessary technologies required to live in a safe and healthy environment. And as discussed in the previous slide, without adequate infrastructure within remote communities, such as clean water systems, access to proper housing materials, and waste disposal systems, quality of life is affected, leaving low-income communities more vulnerable to health problems. The reduced access to public services such as hospitals can be detrimental to these remote communities as immediate care may not be accessible and hospitals may experience staff or medical shortages. Food insecurity is also a large issue as food costs are rising, and for Indigenous communities, their sources of food through methods of hunting/fishing are being restricted. Food subsidy projects are not enough to solve the issue, as communities have to fit the provincial definition of a northern community. In addition, issues regarding climate change and land management are very important in the North, as I touched upon earlier. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Here are the sources that I used.